Welcome to the Art Colony, a podcast about art and art history in Provincetown. My name is Gaston Lacombe. Today we are talking about nature as one of the most important constants in Provincetown and its art colony. From the very beginning, nature was drawing writers and artists to the area. For example, the famous naturalist and writer Henry David Thoreau came to Provincetown multiple times in the 1850s to study the local ecosystem and to experience life in this fishing and whaling town. Then, in the little booklet Provincetown, the Art Colony, which chronicles the art history of the area, author Nyla Ahrens mentions, quote, perhaps the first painter known to have come here, Marcus Waterman, arrived around 1875 to paint the dunes, end quote. So, the dunes, nature is also what originally brought over the first artists. From the very origins, nature was a magnet, attracting creative minds to this remote little town. And this hasn't changed. If you stroll through Provincetown's art galleries, you will see countless artist renditions of the seashore, the ocean, the dunes, the flora, and the fauna of the area. And in a conversation about nature and art in Provincetown, I couldn't imagine a better guest than Mark Adams, one of the strongest pillars of our community, both in art and as a scientist as well. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Gaston.
I'm so happy you're here with me. So tell us, who is Mark Adams?
I wonder all the time. No, I have grown as an artist here in town over my history. I came here in the early 90s to work for the National Seashore. I became an artist over that first decade of being here. Of course, I've always painted and drew. I've had many roles in the visual art community, even well before that. But being a cartographer, geologist for the National Park Service, I had a special lens. And I also have to say that the things that shaped me, that answer that question, who is Mark Adams, it's really partly the AIDS crisis as well. And which is really a subset of the strong community of people that are here.
Mm-hmm.
And the art community was very, let's say, woven tightly together with the AIDS response community. One of the great art events of the 90s was always the AIDS support group auction. It was always a mark of being recognized as an artist that your piece be selected for the live auction for the AIDS support group.
I was not aware of that. Well, nowadays they have the auction of the life preservers. I don't think they did it this year, but they had it in previous years. Is it the same sort of thing they had back then?
It was much bigger deal. It was
Okay.
a kind of a spectacular thing in town hall. And they had a silent auction, which they accepted lots of work for that. But they always selected something like 30 pieces for the live auction. And often the artists themselves would carry it around the room. The town hall was packed. There were a lot of collectors who thought, this is my chance to get John Dowd or something very desirable as a piece of art. Really shined a light how the art community, how the artists were part of both the gay community and the AIDS crisis, the AIDS response, and that art was in service community.
That's definitely something very interesting about the art history of the area, its connection with the AIDS crisis, and that's definitely something we'll have to address at some point in this podcast.
Really, it was the women more than anyone who stepped forward to keep this community alive during that time of crisis.
Let's go back to the very beginnings of the art colony in Provincetown. So these artists were coming here. What were they finding? What was the nature they were seeing here when they were arriving in the late 1800s?
Of course, it's almost a cliche that the Cape Cod, the quality of light, Cape Cod was a big attractor. And
Can you tell me more about the quality of light?
I'm still not sure I know what that is.
Oh, we're in the same boat.
But we could go deep and talk about the Hudson River School, the Cape Cod School, and there was as much as anything, it was a different eye as well as a different light.
Mm-hmm.
Cape was a getaway. It was a place of few rules, and there were these, and it was very connected to New York, the early art colony, as you know. Um, this was a place to get away from the pressures and the competition. It was really seen as a kind of a you weren't outside of the New York scene when you were here. Some of those early artists, which I'm not going to be able to name them all, but that got the little studios in the coal bins at what became the Fine Arts Works Center, Days Lumber, I think it was.
Hmm.
There's great the history of that place with it's always winter.
Yeah.
When we talk about the art history of the Cape, it seems like it's always winter.
And of course, back then, the winters were very different from what we have now.
They were different, and they had little coal stoves.
If they wanted to go paint in nature,
Hmm.
was it very different from what we have now? Was it the same sort of scene, or was the natural environment different back then?
That's a question I really love because actually the project that I came here to work on in 1991 was a history of the landscape,
Oh,
history of the
wonderful.
forests, and the approach in that project. This was an ecological project paid for by Mass Audubon and the National Park Service. It was to kind of identify what shaped the landscape. And so part of my job was to go to all the archives that I could and collect images of the forests, images of the dunes, both the early photographs and the early paintings, and try to extract the story of the land in each painting. And as you mentioned, Henry David Thoreau, he came at a moment that was the peak of the artificial landscape of New England. It was the 1850s was a time when the landscape was highly industrialized. People don't understand what I mean by that, and it seems contrarian, but every stick of wood had been cut.
Hmm.
The land had been grazed, and the land had been burned. And one of the details you see in some of those early photos and paintings is the railroad. The railroad started fires on the land
Oh, really?
every day. And if part of my research was to look at the town reports, and the railroad paid the town for firefighting in the town reports every year. So, the result of that was these paintings told another story that became a part of our mythology, I think. The lone, Hopper saw it, the lone cottage on the bald hillside. They called the Truro Hills the Truro
Hmm.
Hogsback, because there was just this really shaggy cover of low brush of hog cranberry and bayberry that was this bristle. And no trees at all back then. Reading the forest, and you can read it through the paintings. I like to find a story, a landscape story through paintings. If you go to the Mary Heaton Vorse house, that little lane was painted dozens and dozens of times. Even in the Pam collection, there are many paintings of that lane, and there was always a tree. One famous tree that they painted that finally died, and now they've replaced it. There's a tree there that's maybe 40 years old instead of 150 years old.
So, what had happened to all the trees?
Well,
Was the whole Cape forested before?
yes. I mean, not the dunes so much, but some of them were. One of the other things is the maps show a story about the landscape. The land, particularly from Truro and Wellfleet down, was divided into little narrow woodlots, and that was based on how much wood did it take to support homestead. And so you'd get a wide or a narrow swath of woodland to cut and burn in your home stove. So everything was, back in the 18th century, there were still masts for ships. You could still find trees. Eventually, there are no more trees left, and it was just thick wood. It was stove wood. Um, Another actually interesting anecdote is I often I make maps to try to tell the geologic story. And Champlain came in the 1600s, and
Samuel de Champlain,
yes, and he actually gave some insight into what the
who is a
landscape was.
French explorer.
He was a French explorer, one of the first, known for his maps, his hand-drawn maps, but each map had some images of villages, of indigenous life. And then you see these dugout canoes with like 30 men rowing a canoe. Now, we can't imagine a tree that big growing on Cape Cod that would be big enough to make a canoe to hold 30 people. And I was telling this story once, and a kid who happened to be a tribe member said, "Mr. Adams, don't you know everything was bigger back then?"
Hmm. Of
And
the Wampanoag tribe?
yes, yes. And, you know, as that's a story that's actually rooted in truth because there were climax forests. There was this deciduous forest that had chestnuts and oaks in 1,000 years ago. You know, the colonial period started about 400 years
Hmm.
ago. The landscape was devastated by about, let's see, late 1700s. So this may not be essential to the art history story, but the art does tell the story of landscape ecology.
Hmm.
Now, then, at the time of Thoreau in the late 1800s, we romanticized these bald hills, the moors, the idea of a desolate landscape was that was the romantic period anyway, and people still romanticize these rolling open fields and naked dunes, you know, with nothing, stick of wood growing on them. Now things have grown back.
And at what point in history did a consciousness grow that this land had to be restored? And did artists play a part in that?
The Depression, the time between the wars and the Depression was a time of when people started. Well, there were reasons to restore the landscape. You know, it was not productive. It was not productive. You couldn't even have a kitchen garden, and the roads were covered with sand. It was clear to everyone that it was not a healthy environment and it was not productive for even, you know, your kitchen garden. So, at that time, and I have maps showing they created a superintendent of the province lands, the state legislature did, and they planted hundreds and hundreds of the wrong trees.
Okay. So what did they plant?
They planted non-native things. They planted Scots pine,
Okay.
Japanese black pine, uh, all the wrong kinds of pines. They planted what's it called? Cetacea, the Scotch broom.
And they're still around.
They're still around, although it's very interesting that a lot of them are dying. And the native pitch pine, you know, what's well adapted here are the pitch pines. White pines are difficult to grow here, but they would be a native climax species. And then the black and white oaks. Yeah, so they started planting plants to restore the dunes in about 1890, and then between the wars, I'm not sure. So the interesting thing is aesthetically, did our taste change? You know,
Mhm.
did the taste the romanticism of the rose landscapes get replaced by seeing the dunes now covered with trees and the forest land back on High Head and other places? That's a
Mhm.
good question. You know, the again, still the romantic vision is the Cape Cod cottage with a view of the sea. One thing that they valued was the fruit trees that actually came with to the colonies, the Bradford pear,
Mhm.
the apple trees, and that's another like kind of a fun idea that the historians talk about, and that is to map the old fruit trees, go through the dunes, go through the forest, and find these fruit trees because they all are historical relics. You know, there's these lost villages too. We're talking Provincetown, Truro, Wellfleet. There are sites that are well known to be full of old cellar holes. There used to be a village there. And then the other big romantic idea is that the pirates that there's pirate graveyards with gold.
Mhm.
Some of
Well, that
those,
would be great.
yeah, you know, the Wida, the shipwreck that was found in the 80s, I think they didn't find all the gold. So
Okay.
there's a story that the pirates that got away they buried chests of gold in Wellfleet.
Okay, so we have to get this metal detector out, go hit the dunes, see what we can find.
But from a natural standpoint, there's a kind of a very interesting symmetry um, and shape to the landscape where nature's allowed to take its course. We often talk about poison ivy being the protector of the dunes. It holds things together. And in the early spring, we have the shadbush, the amelanchier, which looks like
Also known as serviceberry.
well, yes, exactly, yeah. So the seasons are marked by the blooming of these trees and shrubs, beach plum, fall color in the cranberry bogs and marshes is like Scotland. So yeah, there's an aesthetics of the landscape, and it has been central to painting. But also, I think a lot of the history of art here focuses on these quaint village scenes,
Mhm.
architecture.
You still see that a lot now. For
Yeah.
example, John Dowd does a lot of pictures of houses. Paul Rizzo does a lot of pictures of houses. It's been a constant in Provincetown art history as well. The the Cape Cod house. Yeah.
But we'd be remiss not to mention seascapes and
Yes.
the working waterfront,
Hmm.
which I'm a big supporter of that idea that we can learn about the way of life here by looking at these fantastic old paintings of the wharfs, the mackerel fleet, which Thoreau describes. So there's a kind of a whole n- navigational aesthetic, a marine, boating, and then the weather. So again, like what in nature makes this a great place to be an artist? Weather is a big part of that.
Because we're out in the middle of the ocean here.
We really are. We're
Mhm.
like 80 miles out to sea.
So when this area became a national park, what year was that?
Well, 1961 was the final
1961.
legislation.
I feel like I've read stories about artists being involved in the preservation of the area, the dune shacks, um, that they were involved in the creation of the national park.
You're right, and some of the same people actually who ended up fighting to protect the dune shacks were there at the beginning.
That's the Cape Cod National Seashore.
Cape Cod National Seashore, it's a unit of the National Park Service. It was a turning point in the National Park Service to create a seashore because national parks were often thought of as mountains. They were thought of as Yellowstone, Yosemite. And when they created the National Seashore, they also created one on the West Coast. It has a companion park, the Golden Gate. No, actually, Point Reyes would be the companion. It's very well documented, the history of the creation of the seashore. And there was a lot of sort of horse trading around. There were influential politicians who decided where the boundaries should go based on their land and their views, protecting. It was a time when you could lay down a boundary and put aside land, and there were hardly any people here. So people weren't. Uh, there was no one to complain. A
Hmm.
lot of those decisions, of course, Kennedys were big drivers of it, but the Saltonstall, I think, there were governors and state senators who really were laying down those maps and drawing those boundaries, and town leaders who made deals about it. As you know, the province, what is it, three-fourths, maybe more than three-fourths of Provincetown ended up inside the national park,
Hmm.
whereas and Wellfleet, similar. As you move south, less and less of the land of each town made it into the seashore. One of the drivers was Truro High Head, where there were these shoebox lots, these tiny, tiny, less than 10,000 square feet lots. Tons of them were created. They were all going to be marketed. It was going to be a suburban development.
Can you tell me more about the dune shacks and the relationship that local artists and writers have had with the dune shacks, which are now in the National Seashore?
At some point in the 70s, they created that historic district. And the historians, the State Historic Commission, which really decides these things, they're like, none of these shacks are worth it. These shacks are real historical landmarks. But the approach they took is to say this is a district, and everything contributes to the aesthetic qualities of the district, even if each shack by itself is just a rundown shack. There's a fabric of the landscape, very important to painters. So that was the approach in designating, and the boundaries of the Peaked Hill Bars Dune Shack district were based on the views, based on the viewshed. I actually was able to redefine that district myself at some point when they'd made a vague description, and then we went out with kind of newer mapping techniques to say, where is the boundary of the view? How do we create a protected area, aesthetic area bounded by horizons that will give you this feeling of historical character? Now, okay, so who drove it? And we know Josephine Del Deo was instrumental, and Sal Del Deo. But the dune shacks, as I said, the dune shacks themselves were not any great masterful pieces of architecture. They were made of driftwood and scraps, and the approach to protecting them was that they'd have to continue to be maintained using the same kind of materials. So you have a driftwood shack and you gather more driftwood and repair it with that. So before that time, there was a feeling that these things weren't valuable, and quite a few were burned down. Quite a few were destroyed by the National Park Service before the district was created. There was also a land ownership issue. That a big part of the Dune Shack district was crown land originally. It was land set aside by the King of England in the 1600s as a commons, as a land for drying your nets for fishermen to use. And so some of those shacks were squatter shacks built on this common land. The common land from the crown in the colonial period became state land. So a lot of it was never private. And so many of the dune shack dwellers didn't have deeds because of that. Some did. But a lot of there's one of the other features that affects this character, the landscape, is that there was a big fire in the Registry of Deeds, late 1800s. So a lot of people didn't bother to go back and re-register their deeds. There were sort of bounty hunter types who went and found which properties, not just dune shacks, didn't have good deeds, and you could file a quitclaim deed, claim ownership, and then get paid to relinquish that ownership. But I think the artist did, it was an aesthetic idea and a way of life idea.
Mm-hmm.
They have very strong opinions about what's the proper way to inhabit the dunes, what's the proper way to live, what's in tune with the aesthetics of place.
You worked in many different facets of the national park. I'm learning a lot right now that I didn't know. And you're also an artist. So how did all this knowledge from nature, from the national park, from the history of it, how does it manifest itself in your art?
Well, in my history as an artist, one of my first real projects before I came here was working in a lab drawing fish eggs.
Okay.
I was a ichthyoplankton taxonomic illustrator. I worked for a study of how fish develop. So I did over 400 drawings of fish eggs and fish larvae, and some of them had never been done before, to trace early life stages of these fishes. So that was a really precise kind of technical drawing. But I didn't think of myself as an artist. The event that allowed me to actually have a show, to think of myself as an exhibiting artist, was Travin Pelletier, some other former fellows of the Fine Arts Work Center in about 1999, invited me to a kind of a group occupation of a dune shack. It said, "Mark, teach us about mapping. We want to do a collaborative artist mapping project, seascape collaborative mapping project." And so we had, maybe 8 or 10 artists. We had the shack for the winter.
And yeah, it's not insulated in any way.
No. And so we took turns and we did group projects out there. And we had a group show. And I did a bunch of walnut ink drawings for that show. And I did a scroll map. I was interested in Japanese art and brush painting works, ink brush painting. So I did these walnut scroll landscapes and such. And then Michael Carroll, who was curating for the Schoolhouse Gallery then, didn't own it yet, invited me to have a show. I was like, really?
I mean, now looking back, we're thinking, obviously.
My heart goes out to the process of how artists get their chops and establish an identity as an artist. We don't know what our vision is. If you do, then I don't think you're doing it right. I think you have to develop your vision in the studio, in nature, by actually drawing and painting.
If somebody here listening has never seen your art, how would you describe it?
Watery.
Okay. There is a lot of water in your art.
I did start out really as kind of a watercolor artist and a drawer. I started working in acrylic. I like natural materials, so I paint on wood. But my method of using acrylic is like sort of a watercolor method. I make washes, I thin it down, I throw it around, I splash. But my subject matter was nature and maps. The vision that I came to develop, I think, is what's the point of view? What's nature's point of view? It's not about making a scene around the cottage. It's about getting inside nature and looking back at humans. I think that's what I wanted to inhabit. What's it like to be a fish? What's it like, to be a bird? For some reason, I paint birds constantly.
Then you do it very well.
Thank you. And my background as a taxonomic artist, as a scientific illustrator, comes out because I'm interested in how the feathers attach and what's the structure of color and how do they move. Actually, one of the biggest, most fascinating things to me is how things move. And I've always tried to put motion to what I do. I start realizing that things I did, things I worked on, and things, projects and interests, they all came together. They all were important in some way. So I used to draw the figure a lot, uh, all through my participation in gymnastics and in ballet.
I mean, the human figure.
The human figure.
Yes.
And so, and I was interested in what are those telltale poses that say this figure's in motion, this figure is moving in the world, swimmers, runners, jumpers. How can your brain create a snapshot of motion that then you can put on a canvas? And lately I've been doing these large scale maps that you can walk into. And I've been doing video, and I've been using underwater swimmers in video. And I had a little retrospective at the museum.
A little. You had the big room to yourself at the Provincetown Art Museum and Association.
Yes, it was a thrill.
That's how I got to know you. The first time I ever came across, because I first came to Provincetown in 2016, so it's not that long ago. And the first time I came across somebody called Mark Adams was at that show at the museum, and I was deeply impressed.
Oh, well, thank you.
And then I said, I have to be his friend.
But I also was like, I don't want this show to be just about the past. I want to make something new for this space. I want to inhabit the space. So I started making these giant maps on the floor. Painted the canoe. The canoe was made for that. Well,
and the canoe is now at the Provincetown Brewing Company.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's hanging in the ceiling.
It's hard to find a home for these big things. It's always wonderful when they do have a home.
And one thing I found interesting about your approach to art is you include the science in it also. Often you see little notes written, you see little side windows where you add extra information. It's interesting to see your scientific mind at work when you're working as an artist as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that everyone has that mind. One of the other thing I get to do is I teach summer workshops, and people get nervous. Oh, do I have to be a talented artist? No. What I teach is observation, experience, and I'm not interested in your rendering skills exactly. I'm interested in your eye, and I'm interested in my eye. I'm interested in keeping that sharp. I did. I studied ecology and biology as an undergrad, and one of the things that we learned, write a little memoir about this.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and there was a very kind of elite in the science of natural history. There's a kind of elite tradition of field books, field sketchbooks. But I've just learned that they kind of go back to what was called commonplace books in the Renaissance. You know, collectors, or I mean, artists who collected their observations. Often there was a spiritual component to it, because then there's something called the almanacs, the books of hours, which were seasonal. The Japanese tradition of what does each season mean? There's a plant and an animal and a poem that all come together to symbolize spring. And so I wanted to incorporate the quality of a scientific observer and measurement and time. The idea that you can make a painting of a moment without acknowledging that there's a season, there's a tide cycle, it's within a season, it's within a cultural a moment of cultural history, as we've talked about the landscape, and it's also in a moment of geologic history. You can't talk about the landscape of Cape Cod without Provincetown, without talking about the fact that Provincetown is less than 6,000 years old.
And right now we're in a time of climate change. So what's coming up for the nature of this area?
You know, the challenge here is to understand the past in order to understand the future. And you know, we do know that 10 to 20,000 years ago, which is a minute, it's really a short time geologically. uh, That was when the boundaries of Cape Cod were laid down. That was when the landscape was formed.
By glaciers coming down and pushing this earth, creating a
Yeah.
moraine that became Cape Cod. I this will be a bit off topic, but I have a painting in my gallery called Moraine
Hmm.
that's sold, but I have prints of it. And whenever people buy a print of it, I ask, "Do you know what a moraine is?" And they never do. So then I tell them the geological history of how Cape Cod is a moraine. It's debris left by a glacier after it melted and left. Something like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's actually, it's really funny. The geologists are there is a kind of poetry to science. And there's a lot of geologic terms that have a kind of they like to classicize, they like to go back to classical philosophy to name things. One that I love, you know, if you go to the near the ocean, particularly after storms, and it almost looks like it's snowed because there's a deposit of sand, of windblown sand, sometimes a couple of inches of sand, like in the grass, in the vegetation, on the cliffs. They call that Aeolian deposit. You know, I don't myth in the mythology, it's either Greek or Roman, but god of the winds,
Of winds, yes.
the Aeolian harp was the metaphor for the wind playing music. And but the geologists have adopted that to describe the windblown nature of the Cape. Now, back to the topic of what will Cape Cod look like in the future? And the same forces of waves and tides and wind continue more rapidly with climate change. And so the pace of erosion will speed up. Provincetown, in some ways, is the endpoint of a lot of the movement of sand. So we don't have as much erosion as the other towns. We do have a deposition. We have places that are growing, like Race Point, Way Beach area. That's actually growing. It's gaining
Mhm.
sand. So yeah, there'll be a time when Provincetown probably we will be disconnected from the rest of the Cape by erosion. There is an interesting aesthetic challenge around climate change and sea level rise, and uh, and people already are in the conversation, and that is what happens when you raise houses. What happens when you put houses on stilts? People say it's really ugly, or it's so strange, it's out of character. But the fact is, it's very much in character because if you go back to the 1800s, the whole town was wharfs.
Mhm.
The whole waterfront was pilings. But also, people say, "What are we going to do?" You have to walk up 2 flights of stairs just to get to the front door. Well, this is an aesthetic opportunity. So designers, landscape architects, here's your chance to make it beautiful. Make a house on stilts beautiful. Make this adaptation. This is one thing I really believe is we adapt to nature. We become very good animals as we understand how nature works, and that's aesthetics. To be in tune with nature, to create a life, a way of life, tune with nature is beautiful.
That is beautiful, and that's a great way of seeing the challenges coming up. Just find a way to make it beautiful. Find a way to make it, livable for us as well. It's been really wonderful to hear about your experience and your point of view about nature and history here in town. And I want to thank you so much for everything you do for us here in Provincetown.
Oh, well, thank you. And I always like to acknowledge what this community gives to me. And every single working artist uh, I learn from, and it makes an environment that I want to be around.
Yeah,
Thank
we're
you.
very lucky to live in a place where we have hundreds of working artists surrounding us.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you,
And thank you
Gaston.
very much for joining us on the Art Colony today, and see you next time. Thank you very much.